Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul, and today we're going to talk about a subject that has brought about a number of different speculations, conspiracy theories, and a few facts thrown in throughout not just the alternative media, but what is really going on in the multipolar world. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And our topic is going to be based on some of the speculation that may come out of the upcoming BRICS summit in Kazan.
Yeah, and obviously, thank you for joining. Likewise, it's always a pleasure when we get together. So yeah, we wanted to sort of highlight an article Ken sent to me regarding what's the speculation about what India is considering with regards to BRICS and the BRICS currency, etc., right? And how this ties into a broader discussion point relating to de-dollarization. Now, what this article states is that India may consider a proposal to use national currencies, if not non-binding. Now, what I would say is India is already using national currencies with Russia and has been for basically 2.5 years, largely in buying Russian oil, and we know trading in rupees and in rubles. So it's not something that India is adverse to, and we'll come on to other aspects of India shortly, which I think is interesting. Now, obviously the BRICS, well, BRICS Plus will meet in this summit. This is October the 21st and 22nd in Kazan in Russia. Now, it's common knowledge, and we've talked about this extensively. Ken and I have done it publicly and in other podcasts and in my own podcast, that there's this big push initially, and I say initially, for countries to use national currencies for trade and financial transactions as part of this broader remit to de-dollarize economies. Now, the claim is India could consider this proposal favorably if the decision's non-binding and it's free for members to choose, how it wants to handle currency settlement. Now, what I would say is that's perfectly reasonable. That's precisely what BRICS is about. BRICS isn't about China sends an edict out and everyone has to obey it like the United States does. It's the exact opposite. Countries can buy in completely or partially. I mean, what I would say in a broader sense, let's cut India out of the equation. If countries choose not to trade in national currencies, as a first step, they're likely to lose out in terms of business. So whether they choose to do so or not can be detrimental, because you might have a situation where a country says, well, I want to trade in local currencies, and another country says, I don't. Well, the trade between those two countries may, and I stress may, suffer as a consequence of this. So coming back to this whole summit meeting in Kazan, what this basically revolves around, there's a lot of speculation and some conspiracy about the fact that, yes, there will be discussions about local currencies. This is an ongoing development. And obviously, there's a big speculation about this common BRICS currency, as though somehow there'll be a big announcement that they've reached an agreement as to what that will be. Now, that really is speculation. At this point, there is no evidence to suggest that. What I would say absolutely with certainty, at the very least, there will be discussions about that at Kazan. I mean, and there's ongoing developments. Remember, they don't just have discussions when they turn up at BRICS meetings, because there's always ongoing meetings between BRICS finance ministers, central banks, to discuss such matters, and that will certainly be happening prior to this October summit. Now, if you go back to the BRICS summit held in August of 2023, which happened to be in South Africa, one of the major discussion points was the issue of local currencies and payment infrastructure and platforms. And there was going to be a discussion had, obviously, at the next meeting in October. Now, there's a lot of speculation that India made statements, which were then denied, because obviously we know historically, and we've spoken about this on many occasions, that relations between India and China are, I wouldn't call them fractured, but there are some disagreements, principally around the border dispute in the Kashmir region. And there's claims, well, India isn't keen on the use of national currencies because of China, and that's why they want this decision to be non-binding. But bear in mind, there was a lot of speculation before they expanded the number of countries in BRICS that India wasn't happy with this, and that subsequently proved not to be true. So then the question comes about, well, okay, what could happen with this so-called BRICS currency? And, and if individual countries initially say, well, I don't want to trade with China in the yuan and rupee, I want to continue to trade with them in dollars, well, you can do so. But it might just mean China says, well, we prefer to trade in the yuan and the local currency, so maybe we'll do less business with India, possibly. So there is all this speculation regarding how this future currency will work in terms of a common currency. It's certainly generating a huge amount of interest. Now, we can say categorically, there is huge speculation that something big will happen in October. From my perspective, and knowing the whole BRICS thing extremely well for a very long time, and multipolarity, I don't see any evidence that something definitive is going to happen. The argument of a BRICS currency is it going to be a notional currency? Meaning, can I go into a bank and get some BRICS currency out? Well, no. Then the question is it going to be a basket of currencies? Clearly the yuan would have the highest percentage, but what is that basket of currencies and how do you peg value? How does, anyone peg the value to it? So there are a lot of questions that need to be asked. I mean, I don't think India is going to be particularly happy, potentially, that the yuan will be a dominant currency, whatever that means. I don't know, maybe we weighted 70% based on the yuan, possibly, we don't know. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts of what this article says. So it raises interesting points, and perhaps we'll find in the fullness of time that this is definitively India's position. But as I say, we have to be a little bit careful, and I'm not saying the article concerned is incorrect, because it might be correct, but the question always comes about, it doesn't matter, because ultimately the whole point of the multipolar world is you get to make your own choices. It has to adopt anything. But here's the question. If all the BRICS members say to each other, we want to trade in local currencies, and the only one who doesn't is India, then that's going to be detrimental to India, for argument's sake. So that is just as likely to shape their thought processes as anything else.
Exactly. And, when you take a look at the potential, the speculative, or however they decide to go, obviously the multipolar world is not going to trade one unipolar system for another unipolar system and then just call themselves multipolar to deceive everybody. The fact is that multipolar is exactly that. It talks about multiple different ways to conduct trade, commerce, security, perhaps even military alliances, the whole shebang. So to me, something like this, just like when they came up with the gold-backed currency, BRICS currency theory, or the currency theory, or something along the lines of commodities, where it's oil, gold, and a number of different bases. It's always important to take a look at the pros and cons. And this article actually gives a lot of important facts. It just doesn't come out like here in the Western publications where they say X is going to happen, and then they just leave it for the reader to try to imagine what it might be. Take consideration for what the potential of a BRICS centralized currency is, and we'll use, for example, a weighted currency basket of currencies. First off, they specifically say it's non-binding, so it's one you can use or not use, your choice. And nations who do use it can then make their own trade considerations based on whether they want to use it more or they want to use their local currencies. But there was an example that stuck out to me, and it's in regards to what's going on right now with Russia and India. Russia is selling oil to India, receiving rupees back. Well, Russia does not trade with India as much as they do with China or other countries. So they've accumulated quite a few rupees that they really don't know what to do with. Now, if they want to go ahead and use that to purchase, say, from Brazil or South Africa, they have to go out into a market, do a currency arbitrage, get reals, get rand, and then go ahead and use that to make their purchases and trade. But if you have a central currency that's accepted by either all, a majority, or some of the nations, then you can use those surplus rupees, buy the BRICS currency, and then you can use the BRICS currency to trade into the other currency. And if they want to get rid of their BRICS, they can then use it to strengthen their own currency or use it for trade amongst the other. So it's like a central hub that can be used for nations that don't have a direct bilateral trade and don't do a massive amount of trade, but they want to get rid of some surplus because maybe they have a trade surplus with nations versus an equilibrium or a trade deficit. Likewise, India, meanwhile, doesn't want to maybe doesn't want a lot of accumulate a lot of yuan, so they can take whatever yuan they have, they can get in the BRICS currency, and then they can go use it to pay Russia for oil or whoever. So, in many ways, it's going to cut out one or two steps that are currently done in the currency arbitrage between nations that do bilateral trade.
Yeah, another point worth making, if you look at the size of the economies of Russia, India, and China, if they collectively come together and are trading in non-dollar terms, that has huge implications. Because I think India is now the 5th largest economy in the world. China is obviously, in reality, the largest. And Russia is what, the 4th largest? So, you start to collectively put all these together and you realize the gravity of what a standardized BRICS currency can bring in terms of international trade, and obviously conducted in non-dollar terms. Now, I think it's worth putting just a little bit of context into this, because there's all these big disputes and arguments amongst people who say de-dollarization is not reality. Well, when you look at the fact that effectively Russia has been, since 2014, was when it began to look at alternatives to the dollar, because trade restrictions were actually imposed after Russia had reunification with Crimea. And there was even mutterings back then about excluding them from SWIFT. So obviously, into Russia and a whole bunch of trade partners are using alternative currencies and payment systems. And Moscow uses its system for transfer of financial messages, its SPFS, which is analogous to SWIFT. Now, these are what is admitted to, because there's probably a lot of organization in a whole bunch of countries that will never admit to using it because they're frightened to be sanctioned. But there's in excess of 550 organizations in at least 20 countries using this. And it's growing every single year. The other thing you can talk about is Russia is integrating its financial system with Iran, because Moscow's Mir card payment platform works with Tehran Shatab system. And then we come on to the very interesting China's cross-border interbank payment system, SIPS. Now, to put this in context, in 2023, it processed over 6.6 million transactions, which totaled in dollar terms. Bear in mind, this is not in dollar terms, but I'm putting it in dollar terms, so it makes it easier to understand what the figure is. Over $17 trillion. Now, that was increased by 50% year on year. So you can see there's a huge growing increase, and that figure is only going to continue to increase in terms of the transactions and the volume of payments. And of course, this is all in non-dollar terms. Now, to put this in context, if you look at in 2023, in terms of China's foreign trade, it stood at about $6 trillion. So it's not 3 times, but almost. So who else is using SIPs and for what purpose? And again, because the West has no visibility of it, the United States in particular, then it raises some very interesting points as to the extent to which de-dollarization is happening. And also remember, of course, that SWIFT only accounts for about 50% of transactions globally. So whatever figure you see in there, even though China's increasing and it's still quite modest in terms of the percentage of transactions, bear in mind that's only 50% of global transactions. The other thing, of course, that's worth mentioning with regards to a challenge to SWIFT, and it's not often that this is mentioned, but India has what's called the Unified Payments Interface, the UPI. That's been expanding its usage. That's another one which threatens SWIFT's so-called dominance, because that bypasses the SWIFT banking system. So you can have payments with countries such as Russia. And of course, there is the whole issue of central bank currencies, which causes a lot of anxiety in people because they believe it means a whole bunch of things that it doesn't mean. And this is going to upset people, me saying this, but central bank digital currencies at the moment are utilized for wholesale transactions, nothing to do with retail. And there are alternatives which are to be implemented to bypass the dollar also, because they're new technologies which undermines the dollar's global reserve currency status. And then, of course, another point is barter system, which countries like Cuba and Venezuela have been using for a number of years, and that continues to grow. So these are all the sort of backbone. But then if we look at de-dollarization, you can tell it's, and I tweeted this, but it's mathematically irrefutable, because just alone in a 2-year period from March 2020 to March 2022, the Fed balance sheet more than doubled at that point from $4.24 trillion to $8.96. Why? Because nobody wanted to buy US debt, and the Fed had to print trillions of dollars. And why did they have to print them? Because if they haven't, the US would have collapsed economically and financially. And we've highlighted umpteen examples going back over the last decade of trade being implemented in non-dollar terms. And just go back 12 months ago when, for the first time, China and Brazil trade implemented what was called a closed loop transaction in local currencies, including yuan denominated, yuan settled, yuan financed, and yuan directly converted transactions to the Brazilian real. So no need for dollar as an intermediary. Now, to put all this in context, China and Brazil's annual trade turnover was, in US dollar terms, 160 billion in 2023, and China is the main trading partner of Brazil. And there are umpteen other examples which we don't need to go into today to highlight this point. And here's the thing, people will always say, well, de-dollarization is irrelevant, it doesn't matter. Well, why does the United States go to such extraordinary lengths to prevent even single nations doing so? So Libya and Gaddafi being an obvious example, Saddam and Iraq, another who wanted to trade oil in non-dollar terms. It's why the United States is trying to destroy and failing Russia economically, financially, and the same with China, because they're the primary architects of multipolarity and trading in non-dollar terms. So this is why the United States tries to provoke China into a conflict with Taiwan. The reality is that dollar supremacy has always been fragile. It's only now the global south has finally realized to what extent that's the case. And if they cumulatively come together, and we've used the example of China's SIPs alone, but if you start to get, say, China, Russia, and India as big global economies that only continue to grow, and they all trade in non-dollar terms, the question of whether the dollar remains as the world reserve currency is an irrelevance. It's a statement of fact. It's just, in quite simple terms, mathematical reality. So important point to make as well is there are now commodities priced in yuan and the ruble. There is swap agreements between multiple countries with China, for example, which obviously is in local currency in yuan. But the primary motivation in de-dollarization is for all countries to adopt local currencies first. And it's worth making the point in this public forum that that's the case, because I don't think that's well understood. But if you want to go back historically to the Ukraine meltdown in 2014, that was the catalyst for de-dollarization, and then massively increased when the Ukraine war started, obviously in February 2022. Ironically, Ukraine will be seen in history as the defining moment in de-dollarization, the end of US hegemony, and the end of what I would term the US empire. And in a broader sense, people talk about 500 years of the Western Empire, because before the United States, it was the United Kingdom, etc., etc. But I think it's important to highlight in broad terms the reality of why de-dollarization isn't a work of fiction, it's a statement of fact. And the idea that nations not trading in the dollar makes no difference is just simply incorrect. And the other point worth making, increasingly dollar-denominated debt is being now settled in non-dollar terms between countries. So, for example, China may be a creditor with dollar-denominated debt. It's being settled not in dollar terms anymore. So the idea, because there's all this dollar debt, it can only be settled in dollars, is not reality either. So this is an ongoing process. It's accelerating. And as I said, if it wasn't an issue, the United States would not have encouraged the Ukraine war to happen, to try and destroy Russia economically, financially, and cripple the ruble. And they wouldn't have been trying to encourage China to invade Taiwan so they could then put enormous sanctions on China and accuse it of being an aggressor and try and totally destabilize the whole basis of multipolarity, because it would tell Southeast Asia, we need to protect you. You need a NATO alliance to protect you from China, the aggressor, because look, they've invaded Taiwan.
Yeah, I think a good way to end this as well is to draw the picture that the multipolar world is not limited to BRICS. And you're going to have many different regional trade groups, commerce groups, political groups, military, safety, security. You're going to have we already have them now. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the European or the Eurasian Economic Union. You're going to eventually have one come, probably led by Saudi Arabia, maybe integrated with Iran and a few other, Iraq and a few other. You're going to have, as Africa decolonizes and kicks out the West, they're going to want to probably bring something similar to the dream that Gaddafi had of an African dinar and a coalition. So you're going to have multiple different groups that aren't going to necessarily, they're not going to dominate the regional groups, but they're going to integrate in the entire global South, in the entire multipolar world. And by having a centralized currency, then you can trade from, say, the SCO with the BRICS through that currency, just for transactions that are done from group to group, region to region, rather than from sovereign nation to sovereign nation. So there's a lot of benefit for that by allowing the sovereignty and the decision-making of these local groups to then be able to to integrate and also trade with, partner with these other groups like the BRICS, like the SCO, et cetera, at any given time, and have some sort of balance and recognized currency mode that can be done for in between.
Yeah, and it's precisely why I've done over 2,000 podcasts, which is largely about multipolarity going back 8 years, because BRICS is just a drop in the ocean. It is in compared to all the other developments we've seen. So I think with that, we'll end this podcast. Obviously, we'll come back to this and discuss it in the future. So obviously, Ken, thanks as ever for joining me, and obviously we look forward to catching up with you next time with another subject. So I'll say goodbye.
And I will just want to say thank you to everybody in this community for joining in and being part of the Sirius Report Plus. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, leave a like, tell your friends about the site or the channel, and we will see you next time.